Hi, Tricia. It is so wonderful to be speaking to you. It's kind of better late than never. I know that we've kind of bumped into each other throughout the year. So it's really amazing to just have a quiet moment to sit down with you and have this conversation about kind of this G20 moment that we're in and the African Union and Africa's kind of general role in this space. But also just broader than that, in terms of our Foundation's 20 recommendations and climate and energy democracy in general. Welcome. I will give you the floor to introduce yourself because I think only you can do yourself justice.
Thank you, Raisa, and it's really good to meet you. I'm carrying so many hats, but for today, I'm Precious Tricia Abwooli. I'm serving the feminist movement under Akina Mama Afrika. I'm a Pan-African feminist, a lawyer, a researcher, and a thinker, and a community builder. So thank you for having me.
Thank you so much. I mean, I will just dive into the conversation. Um, Kind of starting with, yeah, this G20 moment. Um, what does it even mean to Africa, and particularly kind of intersectional, environmental, feminist movements across the continent? Does it have relevance? What are you seeing on the ground? Are people kind of aware of what the G20 is? And if they are aware, do they even find it relevant for them?
I think for so long, most of the population in the African continent was unaware of what the G20 was, also mainly looking at the composition of it. And of course, apart from South Africa having been a member for quite long, the African Union only joined as of recent, if my knowledge serves me right. And this is meant to represent over 55 countries, excluding one, the 56th, which is South Africa. So from the wave since G20 was announced, South Africa's presidency was announced last year, is that then this was like the first time people are like, oh, we need to look into what this is. What are their mandates? What do they do? And of course, then unearthing the same routine that then the decisions made this side are also sort of affecting how IMF and World Bank sort of run in terms of the quota voting system. So it carries a little bit of uncertainty regarding what exactly their mandate is, but also like in terms of its composition, is that then it also carries a lot of uncertainty in terms of who exactly suggests what and whose decision truly is taken. So for the continent, really, it is more of a feeling of exclusion. It is not as fair a system as we would wish it to be because of the less engagement the rest of the African countries truly have within the system. Because even when Brazil hosted the G20, is that the recommendations were still very scarce in terms of their engagement on the logarithm. And engagement, I mean like making sure that everyone sort of has like a feel of what it was. So I think for the South Africa G20, for me, and also keeping in mind that this could be the first time it's coming to the continent, this is the first time then the rest, so civil society on the continent, our government, in different ministries, not the state, the state heads, is that this is then the feeling where people are like, oh, we need to, if this system is existing and they have been in charge of making quite a lot of decisions, and also acknowledging that they recently adopted adding decisions on climate, we need to heavily engage and also speak to a lot of what is happening, depending on the lived realities. But also the fairness in representation needs to be taken into consideration. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of hear you just from even the South African context where Even though there was so much kind of hype created about this moment, it took civil society quite some time to kind of position itself, to figure out like the relevance of this moment, and then to do the kind of hard work around sensitizing and literacy development around this moment and what it kind of means, and drawing that link between people's kind of everyday realities and this almost abstract platform. So yeah, I can very much resonate with that. I mean, I wonder then what some of the alternative models could be. What can we do to ensure that this African Union membership in the platform can kind of meaningly contribute to furthering the continent's kind of climate and energy democracy agendas? Um, and maybe just drawing on some of the work that Akina is doing, in terms of kind of amplifying the local voice at these kind of global platforms.
Mm. I think even just from reading the F20 recommendations alone, but also looking at all the conversations we've been having since this year began, not even just this year, from COP last year, 29 in Bangkok, is that the biggest feeling that we must acknowledge as a people on this planet, this floating ball in the planet, in the air, is we must rethink and reimagine what multilateralism looks like.
Mm-hmm.
And G20 is core to this because one, G20 is really not a treaty-based body, unlike like the UN. It is sort of like informal. It could be considered informal. And so, because then also looking at its composition is that it came to cure a certain decision, the financial crisis that was happening in Asia. So sort of then its composition having to make their decisions without it being a treaty-based body, then for me is a really it gives me a little bit of goosebumps because then that means the most marginalized countries are going to be excluded from this, really looking at how the historical perspective has been on multilateralism. And I think looking at even just the United Nations Assembly, the 80th United Nations General Assembly last month, is to really critique and say it was like a common consensus that we must rethink what multilateralism is. We were never truly engaged or allowed to engage in these multilateral institutions. So even for South Africa really entering into the G20, it is not that, oh, it was because they are a state that has sovereign power and, the recognition is that they had to fight for this to happen. But
Mm-hmm.
also acknowledging the historical importance that South Africa also holds. But for the rest of the continent, is that the rest of the continent was still considered empty land, just available for more extraction. So with that is that the engagement in the multilateral system was really very unfair. So it lacked transparency, there was always weak accountability, and this is very replicated in the G20. In the G20 structure right now, looking at the G20 commitments, where most of the commitments are vague, but also even just looking at, for example, the commitment and promises that were made in the previous G20s around like debt relief and even just the climate finance, which is the most recent, you can clearly see that when debt relief was sort of like announced, it always only happened to the global north countries. Of course, World Bank and IMF will always argue that, oh, they have more quotas with them. But then a quota system is not a just way to determine who says what and who determines what, considering that all states are sovereign once recognized. So I think for me, that's one of the main things that we must unpack during this G20. We need to
Mm-hmm.
revise and revitalize what multilateralism looks like. And we must create a multilateral system that actually is fair and well representative of all countries that are considered sovereign, but also countries that bear people and should also acknowledge the lived realities of people. But this multilateral system should also not just work in a blanket or in a blank space. We know there is damage to be repaired. There are losses that must have restoration. There is a lot of reparation that needs to be done, mostly for the global south and Africa in particular. Because charter colonialism, the formality of colonialism ended, because now we know colonialism moved into the books, into the multilateral space. But when the formal charter colonialism happened or ended, in quotes, is Africa was sort of told to move on. We were never told that we deserve reparation. We were never told that we deserve restoration. I mean, everyone got paid from the ending of coloniality except Africa. Former slave masters got paid, former colonial masters got paid, and are still getting paid, but the continent has never gotten any reparations from what happened to it or what continues to happen to it. Take a
Mm-hmm.
look at Congo alone,
Mm-hmm.
and the lack of support with the rest of the G20 countries in its case against Apple and the other multilateral corporations. This kind of behavior sort of like reflects a dying multilateral system or a system that never was in our favor to begin with. So we
Mm-hmm.
need to create a multilateral system that appreciates all countries' sovereignty and all countries' ability to self-determine.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of the kind of calls for financial sector reform has obviously been at the front and center of the South African G20 presidency, and you see some of that language in the finance tracks communique that was published in July this year. But yeah, just going on to this kind of call for reparations and really the existence of um, the G20 as this kind of consensus based platform, right? Yeah, it's a really difficult kind of time to be in. But something else that you said around kind of the accountability of this space, obviously, it not being the decisions in the space not being binding. It's really kind of the stark moment where you understand that the issue of accountability in terms of its like principle within a democratic framework, um, or accountability as a democratic principle is it's just this kind of cascade of like lack of accountability, right? Or the lack of mechanisms to hold decision makers accountable. So whether that is at the local municipal level, and us really like struggling across the continent and globally with tools to hold local governments accountable, that translates into the national sphere and that translates then into the kind of international sphere. And yeah, I'm really trying to think around like how do we transform that level of accountability from the bottom up and from the top down, you know?
Mm,
Um, yeah, I mean, I'm really interested in hearing about some of the work of Akina Mama in like pushing that accountability agenda both at the local and international level. And yeah, just what are some of the stories of hope that can drive us as we do this kind of global work,
mm,
being very embedded in our local realities and very kind of um, like entrenched in our local struggles.
mm. I think for Akina Mama, one of course, our biggest mandate is Pan-African feminist leadership. So sort of like engaging with young women, young girls, and women in general, people that identify as women, but also other gender expansive persons in what does Pan-African leadership look like for them, but also what does it mean to be a political person? What does it mean to constantly engage, but also constantly provide hope as things, move along? And I think one of the biggest things that hold us, that also keep us hopeful, but also provide us with a lot of traction, would be providing solidarity to the movement. And what do I mean by that? Is that in providing solidarity, we could do a lot of convening. So we do a lot of rethinking. The one thing that we must do that sort of provides accountability on the continent is to constantly pause and then think with others, learn with others, create moments of learning, moments of thinking, moments of critiquing, moments of celebration with each other. That way, you reach a wider range of people on the continent to engage them on what exactly is happening. Take an example of like the G20 and when it was happening. I know CSOs have done a lot of work, even looking at like the Africa Civil Society Group. They've done a lot of work in hosting learning spaces, both online, both physically, even just on Mia's other social media apps, messaging apps, is that they've done a lot of work to critically circulate information on even just starting from the very rawness of what is the G20, what is the historical structure of the G20. That must be commendable. And that for me, I'll commend the Africa Civil Society Group because of course we do know that the South Africa presidency has also been um, quite amiss. They have not been very, very transparent with the people, but the people have done the work for their own people on the continent. And that is one of the biggest mandates that Akina Mama also thrives on. We do a lot of political education, which really details everything that I've mentioned, learning together, rethinking together, reimagining a future that we would want. I think because the very first, if you look at our historical aspect, the thing that was taken from us the most was our epistemologies. A lot of our history was burnt, taken. It's even hard to just learn about the historical aspects of many African countries. Even just Uganda, where I come from, a lot of the historical books were banned, or a lot of them are very out of reach and can only be attained by extreme elite groups. So I think the thing that we constantly do is how do we build our own epistemologies? Of course, acknowledging a lot was taken, but now that we are here and we are a people on the continent, how do we construct our own epistemologies, looking at the lived realities we are engaging, so that in the future, things can no longer be burnt, but things have been stored and information has been passed on. And I think for me, that is the biggest thing that we must do on the continent. So kudos to the Africa Civil Society Group for the work. And I know F20 has been part of that, also just looking at the recommendations. So for me, that was the most commendable thing that we could do as a people of this continent. And this can also be reflected in a lot of multilateral organizings. Usually, even just before looking at even just the FFD, the Financing for Development space, when it was happening, a lot of African groups, civil society, even governments really just try to engage their people, really learning from scratch. What does this mean? Why should we look out for this space? What does it mean for our bodies, our humanity, and our future? Those are some of the questions that we constantly ask and check on. With that approach, once a huge group on the continent is very much aware of what is happening globally, then it makes it easy for countries or even just the continent alone under the African Union to create a more thicker skin in demanding for what we want, or even a more thicker skin in actually pushing for our own solutions that we have for so long been memorizing, been reimagining and rethinking around. So I think for me, like I said, the biggest thing that we must do is to create epistemological values, but also places of rethinking and places of learning as African people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think just on this um, kind of decolonial agenda that you're speaking of, and I don't want to put words in your mouth because a lot of people kind of tend to question that terminology. But this kind of epistemology or African epistemology that provides almost an alternative narrative and framing and way of knowing to what has been um, kind of imported into the continent. Um, whether that is our kind of definitions of democracy or our definitions of risk in terms of a climate kind of context, our definitions of, what a sustainable city should look like, or our kind of model societies. When we're developing those alternative kind of ways of knowing almost, I really think that this is such powerful work, because I feel like so much of um, movement across the continent is kind of focused on dismantling, and I think that that's obviously very important work, but it almost drains our energy from the kind of creative work that we could be doing, and it almost
Mm,
distracts us from the kind of creative energy that we all have within us and that we generate collectively. And I really, yeah, kind of bringing it back to the G20 platform, and just the African Union's role in it. I really wonder then whether, the G20 is even a space that we want to focus on. And I
mm,
know, I mean, this might like sound regressive, but, and I do think that, climate struggles must happen in many ways, like revolution comes in many kind of streams. But
mm,
I do think that we really need to think about what we are putting our energy towards during this time. And
That's
whether
true.
that is truly a generative space where we can see the kind of needle shifting, or whether it's time to kind of put our energy into kind of alternative models, so maybe a better kind of agenda could be, I don't know, if you're talking purely like financial kind of neoliberal terms, like setting up a African credit rating facility, which a lot of people are calling for now. Maybe it is in kind of the democracy space about developing kind of indicators that are African owned for measuring the democratic kind of progress in countries, or the levels of democracy. Like what should we really be putting our energy into? And do you really think um, that the G20 is the space to do that?